In 2009, the Nationals spearheaded a campaign against emissions trading, arguing that for Australia to act before the rest of the world would put us at an economic disadvantage. China has since announced that it will be introducing its own nationwide emissions trading scheme. Do you think this gives Australia scope to enter the carbon trading market without being at a disadvantage?
Barnaby?
It was to you. I seem to remember your name at the beginning of that question, yes?
We have a process in place now. You take the China position. China, from 2005, I think, to 2030, will have a 150% increase in carbon emissions with their trading scheme. We will have between a 26 and a 28% reduction in our emissions on 2005 levels without a trading scheme under our current process. Now, what you should really be asking is not the philosophy of whether you have a trading scheme or not, but the outcome of what you want to present. Now, if we're reducing carbon emissions in the process that we're following, then that is the result that really matters, and that's what we'll continue to do.
Ultimately, if a more, can we say, progressive cabinet took the view that an emissions trading scheme was worth having another look at, if higher emissions reduction targets were, for example, decided on in Paris, and it was felt that paying for it from direct action just wouldn't work, would you at all be prepared to reconsider your position?
It's hypothetical. I'll take it as a comment.
No, not me.
No, look, there's a whole lot of ifs and buts there, Tony. I mean,
that's because we don't know what the new cabinet's going to be like.
We have stated that, and Malcolm has stated that we'll continue on with the carbon reduction process that we currently have, and that's been signed into, and also the coalition agreement with the National Party. This is, and one of the reasons we do it is because it's vastly cheaper and vastly more effective. I mean, why would we come up with a proposition that's less effective and just costs you a lot more money? I mean, if we can easily, if you want to just go back to the Labor Party and jam it on your power bill, we can do that. If people want to say, oh, we want to put up our power bills and have a less effect than what we're currently getting at the moment, well, sure, we can do that. But do you want that?
Let's. I'll go to John Roscombe. Pro-business think tank. Do you think a market-based system like a carbon trading system would be a better way of dealing with emissions?
Oh, not necessarily, and it's a question of what do we want to achieve. I mean, China is going to go to Paris and they're going to say they'll still be increasing their emissions up to 2030. China has several hundred coal-fired power stations on the drawing board right now. We have to remember Labor lost an election, Labor lost a leader, the Liberals lost a leader over the carbon tax. The polls tell us Australians want their carbon emissions reduced, but they also say they don't want to pay for it. They don't want to pay for it. So Australia already has amongst the highest electricity prices in the world. If we're going to do something like this, and I doubt the efficacy anyway, direct action may well be the best way to go.
So your philosophical position is it's better that the public pay for the polluters to reduce their pollution?
Well, yes.
Okay. David Marr.
In tens of thousands of homes in Australia right now, Tony, the fact-checkers are going berserk at Barnaby's claim that the government scheme is grossly expensive. It is a huge drain on the revenue. Its effectiveness is extremely questionable. It can, of course, be geared up in various ways to make it much more effective, and one would hope that the new Prime Minister would have some ideas along that line. Except that to get the job, Malcolm Turnbull had to promise never to have an emissions trading scheme, not for the length of this. And that was the promise he got out of that man's party. So while Malcolm Turnbull is Prime Minister, we can't have anything that really looks like an ETS, which seems to be quite a cheap and relatively effective. I mean, there are lots of odd things about it, but it seems to places like California and China and all of Europe seem to think it's a good idea, but it's another one of these marriage works everywhere else in the world, but somehow it doesn't work here. Cap and trade works everywhere else, but somehow it's a crazy world we live in, ladies and gentlemen. How much political capital is this government willing to score people that something effective be done about global warming?
Now, Barnaby, you do get a right of reply there.
Well, I think the Australian people don't want $80 a month, $40, $60, $100. What do you want us to put on your power bills? Because we can do it at a federal level. If that's what you want, people want to vote for it. And when we came into power, they didn't want it. It was one of the promises we made, we'd get rid of it. And we're overwhelmingly endorsed in that. So the Australian people have had their say. They didn't want it on the price of their power, and we took it off the price of their power, and we did find a cheaper way to do it. And that is, I think, it is really about the outcome. If we are achieving what we set out to do, what meets our international obligations, and we are doing it in a way that saves you money, then surely that is the way we should do it, because he's not correct. All they did was they just chucked it on the price of your power and said, there's the solution.
It's back to how you put the arguments, though. It is possible for the Australian public to be given the arguments properly and not scaremongered. And then maybe if we all put the propositions out there and we agree that for the sake of the planet and those coming after us, we need to do something and it might cost a little bit more money, let's put it in those terms, not, ooh, scare, bills are going to go up, vote against it. So it's back to how you present it, and it depends whether we have the political leadership with the will to follow. Now we're following the rest of the world because the rest of the world is endorsing it. Germany is not a left-wing nation, has endorsed it. Huge renewables, huge investment and shifting away from traditional fossil fuels.
OK, we've got a few hands have gone up. There's a gentleman up there with his hand up. Go ahead.
You're talking about, Barnaby, outcomes. I'd have thought that a market-based system is going to ultimately change people's behaviour and affect the outcome and consumption of electricity.
You're dead right. When you say a market-based system, see, the whole point of it, it's a pricing system. If we put up the price of power, you use less of it. Now, that makes a lot of sense if you can afford it. But for the National Party, we deal with the poorest people. And the idea that we get an inelastic product, such as power, because you can't cook half of dinner or decide to cook only half your toast or turn on half your light. If we decide that what we are going to do in that household is make an essential part of their life dearer, and we decide that that is a moral outcome, it is not. That is basically getting someone who's at the lower part of in the lower section of the socioeconomic climate and saying, well, we're going to make the poorer people poorer.
But Barnaby, can I just interrupt here? $2 billion of taxpayers' money currently being used for the direct action to produce a 5% reduction, and that may work. How do you get to 26 to 28%? What's the cost of that? Well, to the public dollar.
Well, even in the last, we have to just go on what we're doing. Greg Hunt in that last tranche, of actually being able to create the mechanism for carbon reduction, he did it at a vastly cheaper rate, and in fact, it's a spectacularly cheaper rate than even our modelling said we would be able to do it.
But can we just get this straight though? There's $2 billion sum of money to produce a 5%
the alternative is
how much for 28? Do you know how? Do we know how much it's going to cost to produce a 28% reduction?
We know that on the modelling that we've got, by 2030, it will be between 26 and 28% reduction on 2005 levels, and China will be 150% above where they are.
But how much will it cost the budget?
And when you talk about a taxation process, the taxation process is to deal with people where those who are richer pay more tax. But if you want to pay it on your power bill, it is a pricing mechanism. It puts up the price of power so you cannot afford it, or people can afford less.
But if you pay for it from the budget, how much will it cost?
You're asking me to be the Environment Minister between now and 2030.
No, okay. I just think everyone in the Cabinet will presumably know these figures.
Well, I've given it to you. That it's between a 26 and 28% reduction by 2030.
No, but how much will that cost?
If we had taken what we predicted the last reduction to cost, for about a tenth the price. So I can't tell you now and every year for the next 3 decades what those costs are going to be. And I think it's rather absurd you asking me that.
On to